New York in 1741 was a city caught between fire and fear. The winter had been bitterly cold, but what truly froze the hearts of its citizens was not the snow, nor the icy winds off the Hudson. It was the suspicion that an invisible enemy moved among them. Within weeks, fires broke out across the settlement, one after another, leaping from house to house, tavern to barn. Flames clawed at the sky, filling the narrow streets with smoke and panic. For a population already anxious about its fragile hold-on order, the blazes seemed less like accidents and more like a coordinated assault. And so, whispers began. Someone was plotting against the city, someone was striking from the shadows. By the time the last smoke cleared, those whispers had hardened into a single, chilling belief that enslaved Africans and their allies were conspiring to overthrow New York itself. The story of the 1741 conspiracy, if it was a conspiracy at all, is less about what truly happened and more about how a city lost itself to fear. It begins in taverns where voices grew loud after too much rum, in alleys where suspicion lingered with the smell of ash, and in courtrooms where justice blurred with paranoia. At its heart were men and women who lived at the bottom of New York's hierarchy, enslaved laborers whose lives were owned, whose voices were silenced, whose very existence was treated as expendable. To the city's ruling class, they were both indispensable and dangerous, needed to build its wealth, yet feared as a threat just waiting to rise up. And when the flames began, that fear found its target. Imagine the scene. A wooden city, its houses packed tightly together, its chimneys forever spitting smoke. In the spring of 1741, fire tore through the governor's house within the walls of Fort George. As residents rushed buckets of water in vain, the flames consumed the building, leaving behind only a blackened shell. Days later, another fire flared, and then another. Panic coursed through the streets because coincidence no longer seemed possible. Neighbors eyed one another with suspicion. Servants were questioned. The enslaved, who moved unseen through kitchens, stables, and shops, became objects of scrutiny. They were everywhere, and in that moment of crisis, the city's leaders believed they might be united against their masters. It was in this atmosphere that a story began to form, a story of plots, whispered in taverns, of promises of freedom exchanged for fire and blood. A poor servant girl named Mary Burton became the city's unlikely witness, claiming to know of secret meetings where enslaved men and a handful of poor whites plotted rebellion. She described schemes of setting the city ablaze, of killing their masters as they slept, of seizing New York in a tide of fire. Her words, shaky and untested, grew heavier with every retelling, until they became the foundation of an investigation that spiraled into hysteria. And so the trials began. One after another, enslaved men were dragged into the court, questioned under the threat of torture, pressed for confessions that would either save them or damn their companions. Each name spoken drew more into the web, until the conspiracy stretched, wider than anyone could truly imagine. What had begun as fires turned into a citywide purge. The gallows were erected, and in the square, bodies hung against the skyline, a warning and a spectacle. For those who gathered to watch, the fear was mixed with fascination, as though they were witnessing the city purging itself of an infection. But for the condemned, the air was heavy with the knowledge that their guilt was less certain than the noose around their necks. This is not just a story of executions. It is a story of how quickly suspicion can become truth when repeated often enough. How fear can masquerade as justice, and how an entire community can convince itself that the innocent must be sacrificed for the safety of the whole. By the summer of 1741, dozens had been imprisoned, at least 17 hanged, and 13 burned alive. Their cries joined the echoes of the fires that had begun it all, until New York itself seemed haunted by smoke. But even now, centuries later, one cannot help but ask, was there truly a conspiracy? Or was it all an illusion, born of fear, prejudice, and the need for someone to blame? The answers remain buried in the fragile records of the time, in testimonies colored by coercion and memory blurred by hysteria. What we do know is that the city believed, and that belief alone was enough to kill. As we step into this story, keep that image in your mind. A city of wood and fire, a people consumed by fear, and beneath it all, voices silenced forever, not because of what they did, but because of what others needed to believe. This is the story of the 1741 slave conspiracy executions, one of the darkest chapters in New York's early history. And like the smoke that once drifted over its rooftops, its legacy still lingers, haunting the conscience of a nation. To understand the terror that gripped New York in 1741, we must first understand the city itself. This was not the towering metropolis of skyscrapers and glowing lights that we know today, but a small colonial outpost of the British Empire. Wooden houses crowded along narrow streets, muddy lanes that turned to rivers with the rain, and the harbor filled with ships carrying goods, soldiers, and, most notably, human cargo. New York was, by this time, a city built not only by trade, but by slavery. Enslaved Africans made up nearly 1/5 of the population, their labor woven into every part of the colony's survival. They carried water, built roads, hauled timber, and worked in kitchens. And yet, despite being essential, they were treated as expendable, watched with suspicion, and feared in silence. New York in the early 18th century was already marked by unease. The memory of the 1712 slave revolt still haunted its streets. On that night, more than 20 years earlier, a group of enslaved Africans had risen against their masters, setting fire to buildings and striking out with weapons in hand. Though quickly suppressed, the revolt left deep scars. In its aftermath, draconian laws tightened around the enslaved, limiting their gatherings, curtailing their movement, and sharpening the sense that any whisper of rebellion could explode into violence. White New Yorkers lived with the uneasy knowledge that those who worked in their households by day might, in theory, become their executioners by night. Overlaying this fear was the wider anxiety of empire. The year 1741 fell in the midst of King George's War, part of the ongoing struggle between Britain and Spain for dominance in the Americas. New York was a contested city, vulnerable to attack, jittery with rumors of spies and foreign agents. For many colonists, it was easy to imagine that Spain or perhaps France might encourage rebellion among the enslaved as a way to destabilize British rule. Thus, when fires began sweeping through the city, the suspicion was not just of individuals, but of grand conspiracies linking enslaved men, poor whites, and even foreign powers into a shadowy alliance. Daily life in New York at the time reflected these tensions. The wealthy elite merchants, landowners, and government officials enjoyed fine homes and imported luxuries. But beneath them lived a class of poor whites, Irish and English servants, whose poverty placed them closer to the enslaved than to the ruling class. Taverns buzzed with resentment, places where alcohol loosened tongues and where racial boundaries blurred, if only briefly. Here, enslaved men might find themselves drinking alongside sailors and laborers, conversations sparking across lines of class and race. For the city's leaders, these taverns were nests of danger, places where seditious talk might turn into action. And so, when suspicions rose, tavern talk became evidence, and rumors became weapons. The enslaved themselves lived under a brutal contradiction. They were essential to the city's economy, yet they had no voice in its society. Many were skilled: laborers, carpenters, blacksmiths, sailors whose abilities gave them rare mobility, moving from house to house, dock to dock. This mobility also made them seem dangerous, for they carried not only tools but knowledge, seeing the weaknesses in the city's defenses, overhearing the secrets of its families. The law kept them in chains, but fear imagined them plotting in the shadows. For white New Yorkers, it was easier to believe in conspiracy than to confront the cruelty of their own dependence on slavery. Religious belief also played its part. The city was steeped in Protestant Christianity, and ministers often warned from the pulpit of sin, judgment, and the ever-present threat of the devil's hand in worldly affairs. To many, the fires that tore through New York in 1741 seemed less like accidents of chance and more like signs of divine punishment. And when fear and faith collided, the result was often hysteria. Just as Salem, half a century earlier, had turned suspicion into witch trials, New York was primed to turn its fear into public executions. We must also consider the courts of the time, for justice in 1741 was not impartial. Trials were spectacles as much as they were investigations. Accusations weighed heavily when leveled against the enslaved, while testimony from the poor could suddenly elevate them to credibility if it served the needs of the powerful. Torture was an accepted means of extracting confessions, and confessions, once obtained, were treated as proof. In such a system, truth was less important than the maintenance of order. The city's leaders wanted reassurance that they were in control, and if that meant stretching evidence to its breaking point, so be it. Fear had to be answered with action, and action, in that era, often meant the noose or the pyre. It is important, too, to place New York's hysteria within a broader Atlantic world. Across the Caribbean, enslaved uprisings were frequent and often brutal, with enslaved populations far outnumbering their masters. News of these revolts traveled quickly, carried by sailors and merchants, stoking fears in cities like New York. The thought that enslaved Africans might one day seize control was not a fantasy, but a documented possibility. For a city already on edge from war, the possibility of such rebellion seemed all too real. Fires became signals, tavern talk became plots, and the enslaved themselves became symbols of looming catastrophe. By the spring of 1741, all these threads wore memory of past revolts, class tension, racial fear, religious fervor, and fragile justice wove together into a tapestry of paranoia. It did not matter that evidence was thin, that testimonies contradicted one another, that confessions were forced. What mattered was that the city believed. Belief became its own truth, its own justification, its own sentence. This was the world into which the so-called slave conspiracy emerged. A world where fear hung heavy in the air, where neighbors distrusted neighbors, where justice was a performance designed to soothe the anxious rather than uncover reality. It was a world where the lives of the enslaved were precarious, their humanity denied, their fates decided not by what they had done, but by what others feared they might do. And it was within this fragile, combustible society that New York lit the fires that would burn far longer than any flame in the streets. The first fire might have been dismissed as misfortune. Wooden cities burned easily after all, and New York had seen its share of accidents. But when flames erupted again, only days later, and then again in quick succession, the pattern became undeniable. One blaze consumed the governor's house at Fort George, another devoured a warehouse, and still others threatened shops and homes. Smoke became a familiar sight above the rooftops, a gray signal that fear had taken root. People began whispering in taverns and churches alike that someone was trying to destroy the city from within. The city's leaders, already wary from years of tension, moved quickly to assign blame. Suspicion fell almost immediately on the enslaved population, whose numbers made them both essential and threatening. Patrols combed the streets, interrogating those who had been seen near the fires. Rumors grew in the telling stories of slaves laughing as flames rose, of strange gatherings in back alleys, of conspiracies whispered over mugs of rum. Fear has a way of shaping memory, and soon ordinary sights were reimagined as signs of danger. What once was coincidence became evidence, and evidence became conspiracy. It was in this atmosphere that Mary Burton, a teenage indentured servant, stepped forward. She claimed knowledge of a vast plot to burn the city and slaughter its inhabitants. In the dim light of courtrooms and the smoky corners of taverns, she named names enslaved men and poor whites alike, men who gathered in her master's tavern, men who spoke of fire and rebellion, men who, she swore, sought to take New York by force. At first, her words seemed thin, a servant's tale colored by her own grievances. But desperation made her story valuable. Leaders clutched at her testimony like kindling to flame. If she spoke of conspiracies, then conspiracies must exist. Arrests followed swiftly. Shackles clanged as enslaved men were dragged from kitchens, from stables, from the docks. They filled the city's jails, their faces pressed against iron bars, awaiting trials that had already decided their fate. Interrogations began, harsh and relentless. Some resisted, maintaining their innocence, but others, under the weight of threats and the sting of lashes, confessed to crimes they may never have considered. Each confession named more accomplices, and with every new name, the web grew wider. The city was no longer seeking truth, it was seeking assurance, and assurance meant blood. One by one, the accused were brought before the court. The atmosphere was heavy with dread and anticipation, for each trial was both a proceeding and a performance. Spectators crowded the benches, leaning forward to hear testimony that blurred rumor with fact. Judges listened with stern faces, but behind their eyes was fear, the fear that to dismiss the charges would invite disaster. Better to believe the worst and act decisively than to risk another blaze. And so the verdicts were rendered with grim regularity, guilty. The gallows became a fixture in New York that summer. In the open square, crowds gathered as condemned men were led forward, their hands bound, their steps heavy. The noose dangled above them, swaying in the wind. Some prayed aloud, their voices trembling. Others cursed their accusers, and some remained silent, eyes fixed on the horizon as though already beyond this world. The executioner's hands worked with practiced speed, and soon bodies swung against the skyline. The creak of rope, the murmur of the crowd, the silence that followed it was all part of the ritual. Each death was meant to restore order, to purge the city of its imagined infection. Yet the hangings were not enough. For some, the fire of suspicion demanded more fire still. 13 men were burned alive at the stake, their bodies consumed as the crowd watched in a mixture of horror and fascination. Flames licked at their skin, smoke rising into the summer sky, the scent of burning flesh mingling with the memory of the city's earlier blazes. Mothers shielded their children's eyes, while others watched unflinching, convinced they were witnessing justice. In truth, they were witnessing fear made manifest, fear that demanded spectacle to sustain itself. The city seemed trapped in a cycle of accusation and punishment. Each confession fueled more arrests, each execution justified more suspicion. The boundaries of the conspiracy expanded until it seemed no one was beyond its reach. Even poor whites, once considered too insignificant to matter, found themselves accused if their lives had intersected with the enslaved. A handful were hanged, their deaths blurring the line between race and class in the shadow of paranoia. It was no longer about who had set the fires, but about who could be sacrificed to ease the city's terror. All the while, fires continued, to flare not always large, not always destructive, but enough to feed the hysteria. Any flame, however small, was interpreted as proof that the conspiracy still lived. Even the glow of a kitchen hearth at night could spark whispers that the city was once again under attack. The enslaved, already stripped of humanity, now became shadows in every fearful mind. Every laugh overheard, every gesture misread, every gathering suspected. Fear turned people into enemies, and enemies into victims. The weight of the executions pressed on the community. Families of the condemned wept in silence, their grief muted by the knowledge that protest would bring suspicion upon themselves. Ministers preached of sin and judgment, framing the trials as a cleansing fire, a necessary scourge to preserve the colony. Newspapers carried accounts that blurred fact with rumor, ensuring that readers believed the city had narrowly escaped destruction. For those in power, the spectacle of punishment was reassurance that order had been restored. But beneath the surface, unease lingered. Too many had died, too many confessions extracted by pain, too many questions left unanswered. And yet, the machinery of fear was relentless. By the height of the summer, the jails had emptied into the grave. 17 hanged, 13 burned, more than 70 imprisoned or banished. The gallows no longer shocked the crowd. It had become familiar, almost routine. The city's leaders congratulated themselves on averting disaster, while ordinary people whispered their doubts in private. Had they truly destroyed a conspiracy, or had they destroyed themselves in the process? As the executions slowed, the fires subsided. The city grew quieter, though the silence was heavy, not peaceful. The gallows stood empty for the first time in months, but its shadow lingered over the square. The smoke had cleared, yet its scent clung to memory. The enslaved who remained lived under tighter restrictions than ever. Their every movement watched, their every word weighed. Fear had not freed the city. It had bound it tighter in chains of suspicion and control. The so-called conspiracy had ended in ashes, but its echo remained. Those who had died left behind no monuments, no graves marked with honor. Their names faded, their voices lost to the clamor of a city that preferred certainty over doubt. And yet, history records their deaths not as justice, but as a lesson, a reminder of what fear can do when it seizes a people, when fire in the streets becomes fire in the mind. The executions of 1741 were less about guilt and more about the desperate need for order, no matter the cost. And in that desperation, New York revealed the darkness at its core. The city of New York did not return to normal life easily after the executions. Though the fires ceased and the gallows grew quiet, the air carried an invisible heaviness. Families who had lost sons, husbands, and fathers to the hangings or the flames learned to move in silence. Their grief was muffled, their mourning private, for any public expression of protest risked drawing suspicion. To shed tears too openly was to invite questions. Why weep for traitors unless one shared their guilt? And so kitchens grew hushed. Prayers were whispered behind closed doors, and sorrow lived in shadows. Pastors across the city delivered sermons that framed the trials as divine necessity. The fires were likened to biblical judgment, the executions described as sacrifices to cleanse the colony of sin. From the pulpits, the message was firm. Obedience and vigilance would preserve the people, while disobedience and rebellion would invite destruction. Congregants sat rigid in their pews, nodding at words that promised safety, though in their hearts some wondered if God's justice could truly look like rope and fire. For the enslaved who filled the balconies of those same churches, the sermons cut even deeper. Every verse became a reminder that their bodies were disposable, their lives expendable for the sake of order. Doctors, too, had their say, though their voices were quieter, confined to the pages of pamphlets and the corners of tavern debates. Some speculated on the nature of mass hysteria, though they lacked the terminology we would use today. They described a contagion of fear, a condition where terror spread from person to person as surely as disease. Others argued that the heat of the summer and the smoke of the fires had unsettled the mind, creating a citywide delirium that confused reason with panic. Such explanations offered little comfort, for they suggested that what had happened was not the work of conspirators, but the work of fear itself. Neighbors watched one another with sharpened suspicion. A woman who shared bread with a grieving widow was whispered about the next day. A man who hesitated before cheering at an execution was marked as untrustworthy. The memory of accusation lingered like a stain, impossible to wash away. Even among the poor whites, there was unease. Some had lost acquaintances to the trials, and though their deaths were fewer, they carried the same message. No one was entirely safe. Poverty, race, and status had all been tangled in the net of suspicion. To many, the lesson was clear. Survival meant silence. The newspapers amplified both fear and justification. Articles detailed the confessions, often omitting the lash and the threats that had drawn them out. Readers were told that New York had narrowly escaped destruction, that the enslaved had been plotting wholesale slaughter, that only the vigilance of the authorities had saved the colony. Each column reinforced the official narrative, binding rumor into history. For those who doubted, the printed word was a heavy weight, a reminder that questioning the trials meant questioning the city itself. And so the presses, fueled by ink and fear, became accomplices in the execution of truth. Yet beneath the surface, doubt persisted. Letters sent quietly between friends reveal hesitation, unease, and guilt. Some wondered aloud if the confessions had been false, if the city had destroyed innocent lives in its desperation for order. Others confessed that they had cheered at the executions only because everyone else had, swept along by the tide of the crowd. Still others admitted that they did not sleep well at night, haunted by the sight of flames consuming human flesh. By the sound of rope tightening in the silence of the square, the public voice was certain, but the private voice trembled. Psychologically, the events of 1741 illustrate what modern scholars call a moral panic. A threat, real or imagined, becomes magnified in the collective mind, and the response spirals beyond proportion. Fear demands an enemy, And once an enemy is chosen, evidence bends to fit the accusation. The fires that might have been accidents became deliberate acts of war. The enslaved population, already marginalized, became the perfect scapegoat. The authorities, under pressure to reassure the people, pursued the conspiracy with fervor until the act of punishment itself became proof of its necessity. In such spirals, doubt is dangerous and silence becomes survival. Culturally, the trials revealed the fractures at the heart of colonial society. New York in 1741 was a city built on paradox. It relied on enslaved labor to prosper, yet feared the very people it depended upon. It welcomed immigrants from Europe, yet distrusted the poor among them. The executions laid bare these contradictions as fear erased the thin lines that separated class and race. In the eyes of the authorities, enslaved Africans and impoverished whites could be condemned together, their humanity disregarded in the name of security. The gallows did not discriminate, it simply demanded bodies. As the summer drew to an end, the city began to move on, though scars remained. Markets reopened, taverns filled once more, and ships returned to the harbor. Yet the memory of the trials lingered. The enslaved walked with heavier chains, their movements restricted more tightly than before. Their laughter, once a quiet form of survival, was now dangerous, easily misread as mockery or threat. For them, the executions were not an end but a warning. Rebellion, whether real or imagined, would be crushed without mercy. The weight of fear shifted from the authorities to the enslaved, binding them in silence even more deeply. For the white population, the trials offered both reassurance and unease. They had witnessed the power of their leaders, the swiftness with which order could be enforced. Yet they had also glimpsed the fragility of their own safety, the ease with which rumor could become rope. Some clung to the belief that justice had been done, that the city had been saved from certain destruction. Others, in quieter moments, wondered if the city had been destroyed in another way, its soul scarred by the spectacle of fire and blood. And still, most said nothing, for silence was the price of belonging. In the end, the community lived with a double truth. Publicly, they repeated the story of the conspiracy, passing it down as cautionary history. Privately, they carried doubts and fears that were harder to silence. The executions had brought an end to the fires, but they had also revealed how quickly fear could consume a city, how easily justice could be bent into vengeance. The people of New York had seen the cost of survival, and it was measured in bodies. Whether they admitted it aloud or not, they knew the shadow of 1741 would never fully lift. The summer of 1741 reached its most dreadful crescendo beneath a sky that seemed heavy with smoke, even when no fire burned. The executions had become a grim rhythm, a drumbeat that the city could not escape. Yet the final acts of the drama carried a weight unlike any that had come before. These were not merely punishments. They were spectacles staged for a people who had come to crave both fear and reassurance in equal measure. And so they gathered once more in the square, their faces pale in the morning light, their voices hushed as if entering a church. They had come to witness the end of the conspiracy, or at least the end of those accused of it. Among the condemned that day were men who had already become symbols. Some were enslaved laborers known across the city for their strength at the docks or their voices in the markets. Others were poor whites, drawn into the web of accusation by the testimony of others. All stood side by side, their fates bound together by rope and rumor. Shackled, they were led forward, their eyes darting from the gallows to the crowd, searching for some sign of mercy that would never come. The city's leaders watched with stern expressions, determined to project authority even as their own. Fears gnawed at them. The gallows loomed against the skyline, its wood darkened by the sun and stained by the work it had already done. The nooses swayed gently in the breeze, like pendulums measuring the seconds until death. Children, perched on their fathers' shoulders, stared wide-eyed at the scene. Mothers clutched hands tightly, torn between shielding their children and teaching them the harsh lesson of obedience. The crowd shifted uneasily, the murmurs rising and falling like waves against the shore. There was no laughter here, no jeering, only a tension so thick it seemed to choke the air. The first man was led up the steps, His legs trembled, but his voice was steady as he proclaimed his innocence. He cried out that he had never conspired, that his only crime was being seen in the wrong place, with the wrong people. His words were carried by the wind, heard by all, but they did not move the judges, nor the executioner, nor the crowd that had come to believe the story of conspiracy. The hood was pulled over his head, the rope tightened around his neck. A signal was given, and the platform fell away. The body jerked, the rope creaked, and silence swept over the square. One life extinguished, one more piece of the city's fear offered up to the void. Then came another and another. The executions blurred into a single grim procession, each man taking his place on the scaffold, each body swinging before the crowd. Some went quietly, their lips moving in prayer. Others fought until the end, spitting curses and defiance. One man laughed as the noose was placed around his neck, a hollow sound that chilled the onlookers more than any sob. His laughter seemed to echo long after the rope snapped tight, a sound that would linger in memory like smoke clinging to skin. For the enslaved who watched from the edges, forced to bear witness, that laughter was both terror and defiance, a final refusal to surrender completely. But the climax of horror came not with the hangings, but with the burnings. 13 men, bound and condemned, were brought to stakes erected in the open square, wood piled high, torches prepared. The crowd pressed forward, drawn by the promise of spectacle. The condemned stood rigid, their eyes reflecting the flames that had not yet been lit. Some wept openly, others stared blankly, and a few raised their voices in hymns, songs carried from Africa, prayers for deliverance that the crowd did not understand. The ministers muttered blessings, the officials declared justice, and then the torches touched the kindling. The fire spread quickly, devouring the dry wood, crackling with a hunger that seemed almost alive. The heat pressed against the faces of the onlookers, forcing them to step back even as they leaned forward in fascination. The condemned cried out as the flames reached them, their voices rising in a terrible chorus of agony. Smoke billowed into the sky, dark and thick, blotting out the sun. The crowd watched, transfixed, as bodies writhed and twisted, their silhouettes grotesque against the blaze. Mothers covered their children's eyes, though some children peeked between fingers, their young minds forever marked by what they saw. The screams grew weaker, then faded until only the crackle of fire remained. For a moment, the city seemed to hold its breath. The fire hissed and roared, and the crowd stood in a silence more chilling than any sound. They had seen men reduced to ash, lives extinguished in flame, all in the name of safety. Some felt relief, others revulsion, but no one left unchanged. The square itself seemed scarred, the ground blackened, the air thick with the scent of burning flesh. Those who had come seeking reassurance left with something else, a memory that would haunt their dreams, a vision of justice twisted into spectacle. The climax was not only in the flames, but in the realization that nothing more could be done. The city had exhausted its fear, drained its fury, consumed its enemies. The executions had become a ritual, and this was its final, terrible offering. There were no more names to call, no more confessions to extract, no more bodies to bind. The conspiracy had been destroyed, or perhaps imagined into destruction, and the city stood at the edge of silence. The people dispersed slowly, their footsteps echoing in the square, their voices muted. They had witnessed horror, and horror has a way of binding itself to the soul. As night fell, the glow of the fires lingered in the sky, casting long shadows over the streets of New York. The gallows loomed empty, the stakes reduced to smoldering ash, yet their presence was felt in every corner of the city. In taverns, men spoke in hushed tones of what they had seen, their bravado thin and brittle. In churches, pastors urged their flocks to see the executions as salvation, though even their voices wavered. In homes, families sat together in silence, haunted by images they could not banish. The climax of fear had come, and it had left a mark deeper than any fire. For the enslaved who remained, the message was clear. Rebellion, even imagined, would be met with merciless violence. Their lives had been weighed and found expendable. Their humanity burned away in the name of order. For the poor whites who had been caught in the net, the warning was equally clear. Poverty offered no protection. And for the city itself, the climax revealed the cost of its own survival. The sacrifice of justice, the embrace of terror, the memory of flames. The people had demanded safety, and safety had demanded blood. Thus ended the peak of the 1741 trials. Not with proof of conspiracy uncovered, not with truth revealed, but with bodies swinging from rope and ashes scattered to the wind. It was a climax of horror, one that seared itself into the memory of New York. The fires had been quenched, but the fear remained, smoldering beneath the surface like embers waiting for breath. The city stood in uneasy silence, haunted by what it had done, uncertain of what it had truly defeated. When the gallows were dismantled and the ashes of the stakes were carried away by the wind, New York was left with a silence that felt unnatural. The city had purged itself with fire and rope, yet what lingered was not relief, but a shadow that clung to every street. People spoke less openly about the executions as weeks passed, as though trying to bury them in the dust of memory. But history does not bury itself so easily. The ghosts of 1741 lingered in the minds of those who had watched, and in the silences of those who had survived. Families of the condemned carried their grief in private, their mourning denied any public form. There were no gravestones for the burned, no markers for those who swung from the gallows. Their names were whispered only within small circles, and even then with caution, for to remember too loudly was to invite suspicion. Generations later, descendants of the enslaved would tell fragments of stories passed down in hushed tones of men who died in fire, of laughter on the scaffold, of injustice dressed as law. These stories became part of the hidden history of the city, invisible in official records, but alive in memory. For the city's leaders, the trials faded into a kind of uncomfortable silence. The official narrative was written. There had been a conspiracy, and the executions had saved New York. It was a story told in pamphlets and sermons, retold until it hardened into something resembling truth. Yet even among those who had presided over the trials, doubts flickered. Too many confessions had been dragged from broken bodies. Too many names had been spoken under duress. Too many flames had consumed men whose only crime was being enslaved in a fearful city. The silence of the officials was not ignorance, it was willful forgetting. What truly happened in 1741 remains elusive. Were the fires part of a coordinated uprising, or were they the accidents of a wooden city in a dry summer? Was there truly a network of enslaved men plotting rebellion, or was it a story spun from fear and suspicion, fed by the imagination of a single servant girl desperate to escape her own misery? The records are contradictory, the testimonies muddied, the evidence long since vanished into ash. What remains is not certainty, but mystery. From a modern perspective, we might call it mass hysteria. We might describe it as a moral panic, a moment when fear outweighed reason, and society consumed itself in the hunt for an unseen enemy. Psychologists would point to the contagion of fear, how terror spreads like fire, igniting in one mind and then leaping into another until it engulfs a whole city. Historians would point to the social conditions, poverty, inequality, racial tension that made such hysteria possible, even inevitable. But these explanations, however rational, cannot fully erase the images of that summer. The gallows swaying in the wind, the flames reaching toward the sky, the silence after the screams faded. The mystery lies not only in whether the conspiracy was real, but in what the city revealed about itself in its response. New York had shown that it was willing to destroy its own people to preserve its sense of safety, that it would trade truth for certainty, justice for spectacle. It had shown that fear could make enemies of neighbors, and that the line between victim and criminal could vanish in the smoke of panic. These truths are more haunting than any unanswered question, for they echo across time, reminding us that fear is never buried, only waiting. Even today, the story of 1741 feels unfinished. Walk through the streets of Lower Manhattan, and you tread upon ground where men were burned alive, where gallows cast long shadows over cobblestones. The buildings are new, the skyline transformed. Yet the silence beneath the noise of the modern city carries an unease, as though the earth itself remembers. History leaves its traces not only in books, but in the atmosphere of a place, in the chill that passes over you without reason. Some say that on quiet nights, when the city holds its breath, you can almost hear the faint crackle of unseen flames. The executions of 1741 did not end with the deaths of those condemned. They lived on in the fear that tightened around the enslaved population, in the restrictions that grew harsher, in the knowledge that the law could be as dangerous as fire. They lived on in the silence of neighbors who learned that safety demanded complicity. And they live on still, as part of the dark history of America, a reminder of how quickly fear can unravel the bonds of justice, how swiftly suspicion can turn into death. Perhaps that is the truest conspiracy of all, not the imagined plot to burn the city, but the quiet agreement of a society to let fear rule it. A conspiracy not of enslaved men, but of fear itself, a force more destructive than flame. In 1741, New York believed it had stamped out rebellion, but what it had truly unleashed was a shadow that has never fully lifted. And so the story ends not with certainty, but with silence. The silence of the gallows, the silence of unmarked graves, the silence of a city that chose to forget. But silence is not the same as peace. Silence is the sound of unanswered questions, of ghosts unacknowledged, of history waiting to be heard. And if you listen closely, beyond the hum of the modern city, you may still hear it, the whisper of rope, the hiss of fire, the breath of fear lingering in the air.